Deng Xiaoping came back, took over the country, and offered reform. Now that reform, the context is quite significant. It is a reform of something that has already succeeded, not a reform like in 五血变法 or Wang Gungwu 变法, which was reform to try and save a system. This was reform to build upon, to consolidate the revolution's success. Deng Xiaoping did not think the revolution had failed. Deng Xiaoping was quite confident the revolution had succeeded. After all, he served it. He had worked hard for it. He was willing to die for it. It had succeeded. But some mistakes were made. Mao Zedong made a lot of mistakes in his late ages, in his old age. He stayed too long, made mistakes. So Deng Xiaoping was honest enough to say mistakes were made, but the revolution was successful. And because the revolution is successful, therefore what we need to do is to consolidate it by reforming it, making the changes necessary to make the revolution even stronger, even more successful. Because if you think that Deng Xiaoping's reforms succeeded because he replaced what Mao Zedong stood for, that would be a complete misunderstanding of what the situation was. Deng Xiaoping built on what Mao Zedong had succeeded in doing, and that was Mao Zedong cleared the air, as it were, of all the vested interests that might have stopped reforms. And then you look back at the Chinese history and the cases of Wang Mang or Wang Anshi, or for that matter, Kang Youwei's 100 Days Reform. In every case, they failed because the vested interests of powerful families, powerful elite groups who were opposed to it. The conservative forces were against those changes, which they found too radical and threatened their interests. And they were strong enough to ensure that each of those reforms would fail. In the case of Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong had cleared the land, as it were, of all those vested interests. And maybe the best example, and this is a hard one to fit in the picture, is the story of the three emperors of the 18th century, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. I say that because Kangxi actually reformed a great deal of what his grandfather left him. The empire was founded by Nurhaci in Manchuria, and Nurhaci was essentially an outsider. He didn't really understand China that well. But Kangxi was brought up by Confucians, understood China very well. And what he did was he really consolidated Manchu power by, bringing together the Manchus and the Han cultures into one consolidated whole that proved to be acceptable to the Chinese themselves. By the end of Kangxi's dynasty, there were fewer Chinese who were opposed to the Manchus than there were at the beginning. The Chinese who fought desperately to save China, save the Ming from the Qing, had died out, and the new generations found that Kangxi's rule was good, because if you look at the early years of Kangxi's reign, he was all the time looking for means of improving, strengthening, and enabling the Manchu system to be fitted in properly into the Ming system that they inherited, to get the two, as it were, really locked in to become the successful system that it became. And yet, towards the end of his life, he also relaxed, and things went wrong. His son took over. He lived too long, too. His son took over, and Yongzheng was very lucky in many ways. He only had 13 years. He didn't rule too long. And all his 13 years, if you look at his record, were full of reforms. In the sense of Deng Xiaoping's 改革, he was all the time trying to improve the system. He was never satisfied. And he was also educated by some of the best Confucian scholars that his father had selected to train him to run this Chinese imperial system. And he constantly found the Manchu side inadequate in some ways, the Ming side not efficient enough, and he managed to continually improve it. During the very brief reign of 13 years, It was a remarkable series of reforms that made the Qing Dynasty even stronger. He was able to pass on to his son, to Qianlong, a really powerful empire. And Qianlong, if you look at his early life again, very successful. And he continually was reforming. Not always to the good for the Chinese. He was also, very suspicious of the Chinese. He was trying to contain and restrict certain Chinese from being patronizing towards the Manchus. They thought they were too superior, and all sorts of things. But at the same time, he was a very fine Chinese scholar. He was very proud of his Chinese heritage. He was always showing off his calligraphy, as you know. And at all that time, in his youth, he was trying to improve the system, to make Manchu power more dominant, more secure, and more respected by the people of China. And I would say for the first 30 years, he was extraordinarily successful, building on his father's heritage. But again, he lived too long, even longer than Kangxi. And the second half of his life, again, things began to go wrong.革命was the Nurhaci's革命, changing the mandate. But it was the Kang Yong Qian, 100 years, century, that consolidated that to such a powerful one that the whole world respected it. By the time the Europeans, from the Jesuits on, and the Europeans that came to China, all thought that China was, in fact, the greatest country in the world. And if you look at European writings in the 18th century, to what extent, from the Jesuit report and so on, they looked upon China as a model for change. And many new ideas about agriculture, about taxation, about administration, about meritocracy, examinations, were taken by the Europeans to build their states. In fact, one of the best examples, one of the most successful, was the Kingdom of France. The French took the Chinese model, the Qing model, very seriously. Now, these are just to reflect on the fact that you can have 改革 and not 变法. Even though you didn't have the word, there was something that was reforming to consolidate something that wins, the victorious. And I think this is what Deng Xiaoping's reform is more like. It is not 变法. It is a recognition that the revolution had been successful. China could learn, master the things that they had to teach, but also had to draw upon its own resources to make it the way it should be. That it still remains true and faithful to its own traditions while being modern and progressive with all the new ideas of science, technology, finance and economics and entrepreneurship that had been learned from the capitalist system. All that could be taken into account, but consolidated, helped by going back to the foundations and looking for the things which would enable this civilization to be even more successful. I think this was something underlying that. I believe that Xi Jinping understood that. He understood that Deng Xiaoping was consolidating a revolution. Reform means that, in his mind. I think he understood what Jiang Zemin was trying to do, give it a longer sense of the past, and Hu Jintao even longer, deeper rooted in the past. But he spotted something, and I think that's very interesting in itself. He thought that during these last 40 years, people had written off the 30 years of Mao Zedong's revolution as a complete failure. But that's actually not true. Deng Xiaoping, from the very beginning, said it was only 70%, it was 70% success and only 30% mistakes. So that was his judgment. But in other words, there was more. Mao Zedong had succeeded more than he failed. And that success of Mao Zedong that period should not be neglected, as there was a tendency to set it aside as being just a period of bad mistakes and to be forgotten. So what he has done is to say there was a gap of 30 years that should be brought back to fit into this continuity, which had been stretched back into the past to the Chinese traditions, but now really is continuous, including the 30 years of Mao's successful revolution of 1949. I think this is what I believe. This is how he understands it. In that way, he's completing the sense of continuity. It is unbroken, as it were. Therefore, what you need is something that is so clear-cut, founded on such solid a basis that you can now look at the future, the socialism with Chinese characteristics for the new age, that socialism, the Chinese characteristics that the socialism will be able to find in the Chinese past and Chinese tradition that would enable the socialism to succeed so that it remains progressive, it needs to have a new frame. And I believe this idea of progress, I've said this before, but I want to repeat it here, it was a very revolutionary idea to the Chinese. All that time that the Chinese culture was so successful, it was always based on looking at a glorious past, a golden age in the past where all the sages were, and it always longing to become as good as the people in the past. We've not been as good ever since, so always looking back. What I think the revolution, and this is really a revolution after 1911, and particularly after 1949, is that actually the future is more important. The Gu-Jin dichotomy, the loading of it was very clear. Not so much Gu and more Jin. And that was already clear in the debates that was going on. But now to recognize that this must be established firmly as a clear message for everyone. And I think the Chinese people all recognize that. The Jin is more important, and the progress is the future. And the socialism with Chinese characteristics based on the idea of progress, drawing upon the inspiration of parts of the West, because the West invented the idea of progress. The idea of progress was not even, in the West, not even touched upon until the 18th century. It was as late as the late 18th century that the idea of progress was accepted in the West. And even then, there were many conservatives in the West who say, if it ain't bust, don't fix it. That was still a very powerful slogan and still true today. So that idea of progress that the West had invented in a way in the 18th century, the Chinese have now taken to heart. And this promise that progress must be our final aim, and socialism with Chinese characteristics must always be targeted on progress towards a better future than the past. And to me, in that context, then, the relationship between revolution and reform makes much better sense. Thank you very much.